Welcome, Jun Hee, to this interview series showcasing HKIAC's leadership.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great. Before we start the interview, I wanted to give a brief overview of your long and illustrious career.
Okay.
Yeah, so it all began at the Korean Military Academy, where you were a full-time faculty member. After that, you moved to Washington, D.C., where you worked as an attorney in 2 international American law firms. And then after that, in 2002, you returned to Seoul and you joined Kim and Chang, and you were part of the efforts to create an international arbitration team at Kim and Chang. And you and the others were very successful in those efforts because that Kim and Chang is nowadays one of the largest arbitration firms in Seoul, and it plays a dominant role in the market. Now you left Kim and Chang with the position of senior foreign attorney, and you went in-house, and that was quite a pivotal part of your career. After more than 9 years in private practice. You went in-house and joined one of the big Korean conglomerate construction companies, which is now known as Hyundai Heavy Industries. And you served there for 6 years. You served as the International General Counsel and Executive Vice President. And by the time of your leaving, you were General Counsel for the Hyundai Heavy Industries Group. And that was a significant experience because there you were involved in several large-scale international arbitrations at a time where there were quite a few challenges for the shipbuilding and the construction industry in South Korea.
Right.
Yeah. After that time, you then returned to private practice. You joined White & Case as a partner in Seoul, and you were also the co-chair for the International Arbitration for Asia. You were co-chair for International Arbitration for Asia at White & Case. In 2019, the disputes team of White & Case was then acquired by Arnold & Porter, where you are now as partner, and you're splitting your time between Seoul and Washington, D.C.
That's right.
Which is a long flight, but yeah.
It is.
And so you've done an impressive amount of investor state arbitration, as well as international commercial arbitration and construction arbitration, not only as counsel, but also as arbitrator. So, it's great to have you to get your perspective from all of these different roles and types of arbitrations that you've been involved in. Then turning to the HKIAC, we were very lucky to have you join the council back in 2014, early 2014. And then later that same year, you joined the appointments committee of HKIAC. And then in October of 2018, you were elected to chair the appointments committee of HKIAC, which also made you part of the executive committee of HKIAC as well. And I have to say that it's very sad for us that actually your term as council member comes to its natural end this month.
Likewise.
Yeah. So to our questions, I wanted to start. I mean, you've had such a long, illustrious career as an attorney. Did you always intend to be an attorney, or did you have a change in your career? And how did you come into international arbitration?
Okay, so those are 2 entirely different questions. Okay. So I'll start with the first one. I had thought about it since I was a young lad, but then I sort of put it in the back of my mind. It was also, I was also thinking about going into academia. And by the time I was wrapping up my military career, so somewhat later in a young man's life, I thought about the option of going to law school to become a lawyer. And in our case, we have a good number of lawyers in our family. And I shared this idea with them, and all of them said, don't do it. We have too many lawyers in the family, hard, long hours, do something more interesting with your life, become an architect, going to advertising, maybe business, but don't go to law school, don't become a lawyer. So I said, okay, I'll take that into advisement. And I did think about it. And then I think a little bit later, I came back to him, I said, I thought about it. And this is what I propose. I'll go to law school, finish my training. work for a law firm for, say, maybe around 3 years to get that training as well. And based on that, I will consider what I will do for the rest of my life, whether that's teaching or working for the government or going into business, because it is, it is a good training. And they said, okay, under those conditions, it's okay, go for it. So 3 years became 5, became 10, and then that became 15, and then you stop counting at a certain point. It wasn't really planned out that way, but and I did have a few occasions to do something else, but I just felt most comfortable doing what I was doing. I certainly enjoyed the work that I was doing, and probably most importantly, I enjoyed the people that I was working with. So I ended up just staying with it thus far. The biggest divergence would probably be the around 6 years I spent as in-house counsel, because that's a little bit of practicing law, but also, it's a lot closer to doing business as well. In terms of arbitrations, that's a different story. So when I returned to Korea from Washington, D.C., and I joined Kim and Jang, on the first day, they showed me to my office, and there was a large pile of documents. And on the very top, I could see it was a request for arbitration. And it said, review, and let's discuss at 3 p.m., so-and-so. And so I asked my secretary what my schedule was for the rest of the day. And the reason I asked that is because I knew at the time at Kim and Jang, the tradition was that if a new lawyer starts, they would take them through the entire building to introduce them to every single lawyer that's in the building to say hello. So that usually will take easily a day. So I asked her, what's my schedule? And she says, you have nothing scheduled for today. So I said, okay, this clearly means I'm supposed to focus on this case. So when that happened, I ended up working for about 6 years on that case. It was at the time the biggest commercial case involving the Korean Party, and not only was it the arbitration. After that, there was the enforcement, several litigations overseas. There were actually criminal proceedings in parallel, and it finally actually concluded with extradition proceedings of all things. So it ended up taking a large portion of the first 6 years. And at that same time, Kim and Jang, along with Baek Kim and Lee and a few of the other major firms in Korea, started to build their own independent international arbitration team. So that sort of went hand in hand. And by the time I had finished that case, I was asked by management, okay, when you were in DC, you practiced international arbitration and international trade. Do you have a preference as to which one you'd like to stick with? And at that point in time, I pretty much already committed to arbitration, so I just stuck with it.
And the rest is history, really, isn't it?
The rest is history, right. Yeah, and it's not a story that's necessarily unique to me. I talk with the good friends that I have in the big 5 law firms in Korea when we all started out at that same period, and many of us for the first time were doing really big cases, frequently with co-counsel, sometimes without co-counsel, and it was a very different environment than it is now, but it was a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the Korean market and international later, but I did, you have such good perspectives because you've been both in-house counsel in a major Korean conglomerate and in a number of different private practices, big international firms, branches everywhere, including in Asia. And you've also worked with HKIC for many years. And so you have also the institutional perspective. And my question is, how do you see the importance of the role of institutions from the point of view of in-house counsel, Korean user, as well as counsel, external counsel? What is most important about what institutions do and deliver, and how do you see HKIAC's role?
Well, I think when I look back, say, to the early 2000s, almost 20 years ago, and we were starting out then, at least from the Korean perspective, uh, I think that when we think about institutions, one of the biggest differences is the lack of approachability. It seemed very distant in terms of our ability to communicate with them freely. We didn't know many of the people in institutions. It was also probably less communicative overall. And I think that that's changed. And I think one of the most important things and differences and roles that an institution can play is communication with the end users in terms of understanding what their needs are. And it's not only when an actual dispute occurs, but even before that.
Mm.
And HKIC, in my view, is doing a very good job in that area. It's a very important area for that, you know, as a council member and as someone who's been working with HKIC for the institution. And you know, one example would be the fact that HKIC has a physical presence in Korea, and the Korean rep, Kelly Lee, who currently serves as the Korea rep for HKIC, is she's bilingual, so she's fully capable of communicating in Korean and English. Plus, she's a former in-house counsel, so she's very attuned to what's going on in the market, not only in terms of communicating and working with law firms, which is very important, but also directly communicating with the end users, the in-house counsels of various companies. So that places HKC in a very good position to not only educate people, in-house people and companies in terms of what HKIC does, but also on a much broader level, what is arbitration, what is the better way to do it, and promote arbitration generally.
Mm.
And again, once you do have a case, I think the fact that, you know, not only Kelly's presence, but the way HKIC has approached cases, and the overall level of communication that Korea's had with HKIC, it's not I think it's no longer an area in which people are reluctant to communicate with the institution to find out their views about, you know, what should we do in this kind of situation and whatnot. And I think that that's tremendously helpful for the end users.
Yeah, I think you raised some really important points about being able to speak the language of the user, because you have professionals who've been in their position, but also who can be there for advice both before a dispute has arisen and after. I think that's critical in their language. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
So, you know, we've at HKIC over the recent years, we've seen an increase in the number of Korean parties on our cases. We've seen some very important disputes involving Korean parties come through. And I just wanted to get your perspective in terms of, you know, you have a long-term view of the Korean market. You're one of the leaders in that market. What would you put that down to in terms of both the general trends you see coming out of Korea in respect of international arbitration and also with respect to HKIAC in particular?
Yeah, there has been a change. It used to be the case that for arbitrations, people would normally just go by default to the ICC or LCIA. Probably in Korea, and if it's a shipbuilding dispute, probably LMAA. There's probably a lesser level of familiarity with institutions outside of Europe. Excuse me. That's right. There you go. So one of the biggest changes is that now Korean companies are much more comfortable with the idea of using other institutions that are well established throughout the world. And two of those leading institutions include HKIC, SIAC in the region, among others. And again, I think one of the big reasons for that is the fact that HKIC, in our case, has been very active in the Korean market, very communicative with not only law firms, but with in-house counsels. So that's been a big difference in my view. Also, in terms of Hong Kong specifically, one of the things that we're seeing is an increased amount of commercial transactions between Korea and China over the past few years, and more recently, even probably a bit more intensely. And with that, of course, comes with the possibility of disputes. And in terms of contracting with a Chinese party, if you do get into a dispute, having Hong Kong as your seat or venue can be particularly advantageous in light of the fact that you can directly seek interim relief from the Chinese court. And that's not something that's available in other jurisdictions. So that's another reason I think that Hong Kong in particular has been attractive to Korean parties.
Yeah, yeah. So you've been a member of the appointments committee now for over 5 years, and I would consider the appointment of arbitrators one of the most important functions that we as an institution do. How do you see that? And you're also chairing that committee now for a little while longer. But how do you see that process, that very important process, play out at HKIAC?
Yeah, so I agree. I do think it is one of the most important functions that an institution can serve. I generally take the view that if you're in an arbitration, the two most important things, one is selecting the right counsel, because that'll have a tremendous impact as to what your arbitration will look like. But once that's done, the second most important and arguably the most important is the selection of your arbitrator, because this is ultimately the person or persons who will be determining your case. So that's an immensely important decision. Having been serving on the appointments committee, if someone were to ask which one is the most important committee to be on, I would therefore say.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. No, but seriously, generally, of course, it is ideal that the parties select their own arbitrator or arbitrators. I mean, that's what is most ideal, and it's when that is not achievable, then the institution steps in, and we have a lot of lively discussions on the appointments committee. Because people obviously have very different views, and that's a good thing. But generally speaking, of course, the first thing we'll try to take into account is the views of the parties, whether they have any explicit agreement on the criteria or people. And even when we have to come up with a name or names, we will try to get feedback from the party as initial matter as well. But in terms of what we actually go through and what the Secretariat goes through, in some respects, I think it's not that different from the basic approach that counsel goes through when they're trying to select an arbitrator, which would include the identity of the parties, which includes the nationality, where they're located, their language, what legal culture they come from. The same would apply to the counsel for the parties. And if there are arbitrators that have been already nominated, though that same analysis of those same factors are also considered. Then you'd consider the seat of the arbitration, the language of the contract. Aside from that, the actual language that is used by the parties in their communications is also important. The complexity of the dispute, the nature of the dispute, the size of the dispute, are all things that we consider. And once we sort of narrow down to a number of candidates, then we'll also consider the availability of that particular arbitrator. As I said, the language skills or their legal background is also considered. We'll also consider how that person would be, would he be well suited when we consider the other tribunal members who may have already been appointed in terms of their legal background, their seniority, or other factors, depending on the size of the case, where they are located, whether their travel expenses is going to be issue, those are also something that we consider. Everyone has a different rate or fee. So again, depending on the size of the case, that's something we might consider. And of course, we'll also consider our own experience with that arbitrator and feedback that we've received from other parties in council throughout the years. And of course, one other thing to keep in mind is that HKIC has a very large pool of arbitrators, and it's all public. So council and parties can access that on the website. And there is the panel, there is the list, and there are also several sort of specialist panels, whether it's IP or financial or domain name disputes, they're a bit more specialized. So if a party or council is not really sure of what they want, then they will have plenty of options that they can consider. And I think one of the nice things that we have is that we have a large number of options to choose from. So that's always a good thing. But having said that, there are still cases in which, because of the unique circumstances of whether it's the governing law or the nationality of the parties, that we have to go outside of the list and panel. And I also think that's a good thing because although we try to be as comprehensive as possible, it's not realistic unless you have an unmanageably large number of people to capture everything. So in that respect, we don't feel bound by limiting ourselves to people that are already on the panel or list or whatnot. And I have to say that one of the nice things about working on the appointments committee in particular is that we have people from very diverse backgrounds in terms of where they practice and their areas and the types of firms. So when we do get into an area in which we want to think about options outside the panel or list, I think the secretariat always comes up with good options, and committee members are also able to add their insight as to the people that are being proposed, as well as offer other candidates as well. So it's a very interesting process, and as I said earlier, it does lead to a lot of lively debates because people do have different views. And we don't always get it right, I suppose, but we certainly do our best. In some respects, I suppose, in this process, you'll have a situation in which one of the parties is a little bit happier, the other party maybe a little bit less, or you can have a situation in which both sides are not entirely happy, or you can have a situation in which both sides are very happy. Or the final situation would be that, both sides, they can live with that result. And while we strive to have everyone to be very happy, if we get to, they can both live with it, I think we've probably done our job.
Yeah, I'd agree. Thank you for that, Jun Hee. Thank you for that really comprehensive insight into the workings of the appointments committee. I think there's a lot of work that goes into that, and a lot of cases that come through every week. So we've really appreciated all of your contributions to that role.
Yeah, it's been a great pleasure, and it is. You're right. It is a lot of work, and I think it's something that all the committee members are enjoy doing, and they're committed to the cause. And it's certainly has been worth it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Jun Hee. That brings us to the end of our interview. I want to thank you for your time, not just now, but for over the years working with us. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. It's been my entire pleasure. It certainly has gone by much faster than I thought. The world has certainly changed in the past 5-6 years tremendously. But I look forward to continually working with HKIC in a variety of different matters, and I wish everyone all the best success.
Thank you.
Thank you.